When Evening Star emerged from Swindon Works in March 1960, her place in the history books was assured as the last steam locomotive to be built for British Railways. From the time she entered service, it was to be less than 9 years before steam traction was eliminated by British Railways from their standard gauge system. While 92-220 never worked over the Settle and Carlisle line in her service days, many of her sisters did. These final years of their short lives saw a pretty ill-kempt and ever-reducing fleet still manage to perform their duties with vigour. For the steam locomotive, the 1960s were indeed the grime and glory days. We move ahead of 92-125 and back a couple of years to the line's northernmost point. As well as the steam locomotive itself, there was much else of interest to be found at this time that has since made way for progress. For example, this vintage coach. Jubilee Abercur departs, heading for Crewe. By contrast to 5681's grimy condition, the last-built Duchess presents a far more respectable picture. After electrification of the West Coast main line, the need for Stanier's Pacifics was greatly reduced. And by now, his Pioneer 462 had been cast aside. At least this famous engine was allowed to lie in state in relatively clean condition. While she will always be remembered, many far more humble locomotives are now long forgotten. Austerity engines often featured in Richard Willis's films. Here at Nottingham, this single shot was to provide a pair of these 280s. By now, Richard can hear the second engine to his right. All he has to do is pick it up in his viewfinder. As the second WD heads north over London Road, we move to Loughborough, where a sister greets us. While heading south is an 8F with a very interesting working. This track relaying train provides a preview to a sequence we will later see at Rothley on the former Great Central. Our current location is close to the point that the GCR used to cross the Midland Line, and we see 9Fs on both. South to Leicester Midland, where the freight engine theme continues with lingering views of this 8F. Introduced in 1935, this class was another major success for the LMS. Stanier's 280s were of particular benefit on former Midland lines, where previously the bulk of heavy freight work was handled by 060s, like this 4F. We now switch attention away from freight engines. for the appearance of Jubilee Amethyst. While 5Xs were a common sight at Leicester Midland, it is to the nearby Great Central Station that we need to move to more easily find Royal Scots. Our reward is the appearance of 6111, backing up to the station in readiness for a southbound working. Royal Fusilier is to take over a parcels train, engines being changed in the through road. Like most steam classes, by 1964, the Royal Scots were under threat. As soon as D1541 passes, Royal Fusilier sets off. Destination, Marylebone. Despite the engine's rundown condition, the rate of acceleration is impressive. The departure theme is completed south of the station with a sister Scot. As the 60s progressed, it was Black Fives that came to dominate the Great Central scene. An unusual sight at Leicester was a 9F at the head of an express passenger train. A more typical working for the type is found with a move to Belgrave and Birstall. Less common is a Britannia. Here, Hereward the Wake is seen at the head of a southbound fish train. A move from late evening to early morning provides a Black 5 with a Nottingham-bound 3-coach semi-fast. Numerous visits here allowed Richard to explore many photographic locations. Back to Royal Scots, this time 6122. It was a sister civil service rifleman that worked this Ian Allen rail tour. By 1964, another special event was sighting a Gresley V2 on the GC. After their takeover in 1958, the LMR favoured their own motive power types. It was here that Richard Willis conducted many filming experiments. This is the start of a passing trains shot. While Black Fives tended to dominate the Great Central in its final few years, the class by no means had a monopoly. For our final view at the south end of the station, we move to the island platform for the passing of this 9F. As well as the selection of steam power to be seen, the line did have its share of diesel traction. At this time, DMUs shared local workings with a variety of steam types. A short move north finds a Type 3 at the head of a Bournemouth-Newcastle express. Residents in the houses to the left of the picture were able to take a shortcut over this pedestrian crossing. This was another favourite location, the sun providing interesting backlight effects. The reputation of GC engine men for brisk working is well known, and ably demonstrated by the crew of this Scot. With the closure of the line coming in 1966, it is perhaps a bit of a surprise to find this 8F at Railscene only a few years earlier working a track relaying train. The whole ensemble, including crane, were probably based at Annesley, travelling out to take over a section of line at weekends to progress their work. Typically, a crew this size could relay up to a mile of track in a long day. While track can still be found in use today at Railscene, the same cannot be said for our next location. This view was filmed some years before the station's demolition, and happily allows us a further opportunity to view a Thompson B1 in regular service. Although named Blacktail, sadly by now the engine is devoid of nameplates. B1s also had their moment on special workings. This rail tour had originated from London using green Southern Region stock. The B1s are now to be displaced. Accordingly, once uncoupled, they move off light engine heading for the shed. Now leading to the left of the picture is 61131. She had once before been involved in a special working with the Southern flavour. On that occasion, the star turn was this unrebuilt West Country. Salisbury has already worked in from Leicester and now awaits her next turn of duty. Working solo this time, 61131 coasts in. This is the end of her turn, so once more she heads off to the shed. By now it's getting late in the day, but before Salisbury can proceed further, the very necessary task of replenishing her tender tank must be undertaken. Once completely satisfied they have filled the tank, engine and crew take their leave. We contrast this original Light Pacific with a rebuilt sister by virtue of a move south to Waterloo. The Bulleid theme continues at Weybridge. Pacifics may have monopolized the photographic limelight, but there was more to see. BR Standard 460s, together with Maunsel's highly successful moguls, handled the bulk of mixed traffic duties in the last decade of Southern steam. From Weybridge, southeast to Bisley. This is the famous racetrack, where the last 100-mile-per-hour steam workings took place. Once again, we are reminded that there was more to Southern steam than Bulleid Pacifics. Class U's had their share of glory on rail tours, as here, far from home, piloting a Q1. Also far from the southern region, at Nuneaton, is Merchant Navy Holland America Line. Merchant navies, in particular, became widely travelled in the final years of steam. This was not the first time one had worked to York. In order to get onto York Shed, Lamport and Holt Line has to engage in a fair bit of toing and froing. There was no shortage of special workings on the southern region itself. The use of Britannia Mercury provides an unusual alternative to Bulleid power. Watching these views, it might seem the sun shone brightly all the time in the 1960s. This, of course, was not the case. Our location is Derby Midland, and while far from perfect filming conditions, nonetheless rather atmospheric. The main purpose of Richard's visit was to film one particular Riddles Pacific. Britannia had proven particularly elusive over the years. Given the conditions, she does little to help our cameraman get a good shot. However, the snow in the winter of '65 did provide some memorable scenes. This location is near Belgrave and Birstall. Richard and a colleague had ventured out on this chilly day to film Ivat Mogul 3002 on this SLS special. As well as providing a picturesque backdrop for steam in action, snow softens the harsh reality of a scrapyard scene. Cohen's Kettering Yard proved final resting place for this 66 tank. She arrived with a sister from Stourbridge in February 1966. Their ultimate fate is in no doubt. A happier scene is provided south of Hereford. The line from Newport saw a variety of Western motive power right up to 1965. A type not often recorded on film is the Collet 260. We initially thought our next shot was of a Grange, but the tender is one feature that marks it as a whole. While holes can still be found today, many features of the steam era have gone forever. We assume this crew have plenty of water, as we are to be denied the sight of the troughs in use. For the smallest Western 460 type, we moved to Wales. There is a 3-to-1 chance that any service day's picture of a manor will feature an engine that was destined for preservation. By greater coincidence, the only 2 Richard ever filmed survive today on the same railway. But this is Welshpool, January 1965, and 7802 has worked here with an SLS special. The next leg of her journey is north to Oswestry, but first she has to be turned. One of our script researchers, a northwestern man, made a rather unkind comment on his notes at this point. Observe, turntable complete with swimming pool, typical GW staff amenities. However, on this cold, damp January day, no one seems tempted in for a quick dip, all efforts being concentrated on readying Bradley Manor for her run to the north. This was a sad day, effectively marking the end of the class's long association with the former Cambrian Railways system. Turning complete, 7802 runs forward prior to reversing back to her train. Damp they might have been, the crew seem intent on providing a good show. Next stop, Oswestry. Towards the end of the day, participants crowd around the engine in order to get that final shot. From here, the tour will carry on to Whitchurch. Who on this day could have thought that they would, over 20 years later, be able to plan another trip behind 7802? Most enthusiasts will be familiar with our next engine, but not quite in this state. A shabby-looking Clun castle somehow seems a bit of a shock. However, the engine due to take over the working does look far more presentable. Note the absence of William Shakespeare's nameplates. Having taken over from Clun here at Stratford, the Britannia seems to make quite a meal out of getting the train underway again. While Britannias were still relatively plentiful, by now Clun is sole representative of her class in service. The engine's subsequent history is well known, and while she was destined for an honourable working retirement, this was not the fate of the majority of her sisters. 5018 had the dubious distinction of being the only castle cut up at Kettering. Other than that, she was just one of many cast aside as the 60s progressed. Around 1963, this could have been any one of a number of locations. In fact, it is Crewe. A rather depressing sight, but a move to the station itself will provide a selection of working vintage transport. We move inside for live steam. The presence of overhead wires kept these shots out of the earlier Liss films. Now that steam under the wires is such a rarity, these views of Jutland's manoeuvres have their own place in the record book. Also light engine at the far side of the station is Morning Star. Back to the Jubilee as she reverses up to her train. (7354's run past precedes Jutland's departure. No day here would be complete without a visit to the shed area. It is a sobering thought to remember that on any day in 1963, Crewe North Shed could house over 50 steam locomotives. And a pretty rich variety at that. While the Royal Scot is an attraction, we seek Stanier Duchesses, and that tender is the start of the trail. (6228) seems in immaculate order, but a move back to the station provides a complete contrast. As if in shame, Duchess of Gloucester cowers in the corner of our picture as a sparkling BR Standard drifts by. Dignity is restored with a powerful departure. Still under the wires, but at Tamworth with a southbound Scot. While that is a good baker's dozen, the load being worked by this standard 460 would give the efficiency experts a fit. Finally to Rugby Midland, with the Britannia drifting past the coal tower. In the station, Royal Scot 6110 is prepared for the next leg of her trip. After the departure of this Peterborough local, Grenadier Guardsman hits the trail. Meanwhile, the Britannia is still being coaled, but a sign of the times. That wagon is not part of an express train. The decline of the Duchesses could not be better demonstrated as once again Duchess of Gloucester enters the picture on a southbound working. Wasn't this engine ever clean? This graffiti was probably still on its tender when cut up at Troon in October 1965. At least the fireman's headgear is clean. As 6225 takes her final bow for us, a reminder that the whole class were not as unkempt in their final years. City of London became a rail tour favourite and is seen here invading the East Coast Main Line at Burton Coggles and further south at Abbots Ripton. Another city to gain fame was 6251, here passing through Leamington. A move to Birmingham New Street in 1964 again finds City of Nottingham unusually running tender first, hauling empty rail tour coaching stock. By now, many of those present must have realised that the writing was on the wall for 6251 and her remaining sisters. It hardly seems credible that this immaculate machine would be reduced to scrap within months. But such was the reality. You may recall that this was the engine we saw on the Great Central at Aylstone in Mainline Steam Routes Volume 1. This was the second cameraman shot, which we have not previously seen. But back to the moment, and once uncoupled 6251 moves off ready to run round. This highly successful tour ran from Birmingham to Carlisle, with further participants arriving behind this Black 5. As departure time draws near, City of Nottingham runs round to join the head of her train. Finally, off into the history books. We remain at New Street for the start of our next section, featuring the locomotives of the former LNER. Approaching is an interloper, Peppercorn A1 W.P. Allen. Peppercorn's Pacifics were highly regarded, although less popular in general circles than Gresley's designs. Our move to King's Cross allows us to start a second trip down the East Coast Main Line. On this occasion, we are particularly on the lookout for the less glamorous types, so often missed by contemporary photographers. At the end of the platform, a further A1 is found. Having worked in from the north, Kittiwake backs out to go on shed. After taking on fresh coal, water and crew, plus being turned, 60120 runs back in to take up her next duty. Servicing would have included removing ash from the smoke box, so a quick check to ensure the door is tightly shut is a wise precaution before setting off. If left loose, the crew would be in for a tough time, with a severe loss of draft producing poor steam. As the A1 heads north, the cycle is complete as the train's previous engine backs out to the shed. Our return to Abbots Ripton finds 60055 in full flight. But our journey is not just about Pacifics. At the other end of the glamour scale, we find this WD-280 heading north. Here a sister at Yaxley. On to Peterborough, and our first sighting of that most graceful design, the A4. Graceful is not a word that could be applied to the Thompson A2. Nominally a peppercorn engine, Suncastle moves off to the North Yard. Far better proportioned is the Peppercorn A1 with forward-mounted cylinders. A good number carried names revered in LNER circles. Thomson produced the prototype A1, but the rest were peppercorn developments, including this, one of 5 with roller bearings. Named after Richard Willis's favourite railway, she was captured more than once by him on film. Back at Peterborough, 60156 heads for the shed area. Attention turns to a German deflected A3 with Great Northern tender. One of the last constructed, in spite of its low BR number. Suncastle once again, backing up to take over the train, allowing us a further opportunity to study this rather ungainly machine. Cameronian beats a hasty retreat. Over to our right, thoughts turn to making the most elegant departure possible. Back on the platform, a V2, perhaps showing how it should be done. On the left, 60065 waits to change roads and take over her next working. Like Cameronian, seen earlier, she's fitted with an early tender and German VIT-type smoke deflectors. These fittings rather characterized the class in their final years, proving very effective at improving visibility after the engines were fitted with kill-chap exhausts. Our departure involves a bit of filmmaker's license. Note the leading coach. North of the station, the departure theme continues with 60044. We stay with Melton, moving north to Essendon. Variety is provided on cue by this A2. Note the fitted van behind the 10th carriage. A stopover at Burton Coggles finds A1 Amadis. The bush that swallows up these coaches in turn reveals Falcon. Following 60025's direction, we move to the next major station on the former GN main line. Here a major attraction was the locomotive shed and adjacent yard. The changes that have taken place on our railways in the last 25 years or so are demonstrated by these views. On our last visit, in Volume 1, we concentrated on A3 Pacifics, particularly 60112 St. Simon. This, the last in BR's A3 numbering series, was in fact a very early example, the 12th build. This classic shot was excluded from previous productions. The reason today seems insignificant. Note the minor light intrusion on the right of the picture. Approaching in the distance is the familiar shape of a 9F. While these 210s were to be found all over the former LNER, the old company's freight engines were still about. Rarely filmed, the O2 was the pioneer Gresley three-cylinder locomotive. Lack of cab side windows denotes an original type of engine. Unlike this rebuilt ex-Great Central ROD, LNER Class 048. True successors to the RODs were Riddle's WD-280s. At York, a pair present themselves for our inspection. Sitting here in 1963, you could have ancient, a J27, or modern. Richard Willis chose a move to the shed yard, finding a pre-grouping B16. This one was rebuilt in the 1940s with Wilshut's valve gear throughout. The shot continues with A1 St. Mungo at rest, while to the left are Hughes Crab and a V2. The V2s were very much part of the York scene in steam days. With tender fully loaded, 60872 passes over the Scarborough line. On another day at the north end of the station, she provides us with a timeless cameo. Having backed her train into the bay, she is away light engine. Many travellers will have walked this path. With the passage of time, even this view is now part of history. Due to their lack of portability, Richard Willis rarely used a tripod. This next shot is an exception to the rule. Another exception, certainly in this program, an A3 without German deflectors. Gainsborough provides our cue to head north again. Those who made this journey with us before will recognize this favourite location between York and Darlington. By 1963, the A3s were in serious decline. We break our journey northward to remember some of their finer final moments, with Flying Fox at Burton Coggles. She was destined to be the last of the original GNR type to remain in service. Note the Gresley stop. Duffield, Derbyshire, in spring 1964, and an immaculate blink bonnet. If you have dedicated to steam, see the 1930s King's Cross Yard section for an interesting view of this engine as built. Sadly, here she has but a few months more. But this is not to be our last A3, and we continue our journey. Next stop, Newcastle. Here in Steam Routes 1, we incorrectly describe the tank engine seen as an L1. It is in fact a V3. A small part of the original shot is used in our next sequence, which provides a fascinating record of workings over the complex Diamond Crossing in the 1960s. On the left, a goods train bound for Sunderland. Under us, the 262 tank, again on an ECS working. As the V3 approaches the station, out comes an express headed by the unique DP2. The away shot features a brush-type fall, while approaching is the A3 destined to be the last member of the class withdrawn, Principality. Again, a small part of this sequence has been seen before, but bears repetition in this full-length version of a classic series of shots. As well as the V3s, Newcastle boasted a particularly famous tank engine. This J72 was the regular station pilot in the 1960s and became well known after being repainted in Northeastern Railway livery. With the passing of the years, much is still recognizable within the station interior, although advertising and shop front styles have changed noticeably with the passage of time. But this was a time of change. Deltics now headed the major services, displacing Gresley's Pacifics. But the latter could still be found and did draw the crowds. The subject of all this attention is a very grimy Guillemot. She's working an Edinburgh King's Cross service, a somewhat unusual sight in the summer of '63, when A4s were becoming a rare sight south of Newcastle. While Guillemot heads south, we need to go north. Going our way is Miles Beaver, with signs of the new era all around. Our destination is Edinburgh Waverley. It has to be said that A4s did not always draw crowds like this in the 60s. But this is a special run, made after the last A4s in regular service had been withdrawn. While the sign says diesel trains to Glasgow, we are on the lookout for steam. A move to this virtually deserted platform finds a B1 arriving with a local service. Although not necessarily associated with Scotland, some 20% of the class were shedded north of the border in 1961. The final stages of our pursuit of former East Coast motive power take us west to Cumbernauld. As 73107 heads south, we move in the opposite direction to view this A4. The location is Green Hill, and as well as A4s, many Black 5s saw out their days on this line. Note the early BR emblem on the tender. That emblem was part of a bygone era, as is our next find, a pre-grouping Reed 060. Our northernmost location on this trip is here at Larbert. Several A4s had a good few years ahead of them working over the old Caledonian main line. One in particular was destined to take up permanent residence in Scotland. Of the Scottish refugees, Bittern and Union of South Africa live on, but they were not all so lucky. Golden Plover is working north with a service to Aberdeen. Her stopover allows us a chance to move to the other end of the platform for her departure. All good things must come to an end. For the A4s, it was September 1966 when the final two were withdrawn. Most of us have a favourite engine or two that did not make it into preservation. We will not dwell on these ugly scenes. It's so much better to remember steam as it was in the grime and glory days.